Years ago, after a busy Thanksgiving, my niece, who at that time was 6 years old, had been running around and overstimulated all day. Her mom, my sister, said, would you mind going to read to her? And just read to her until she goes to bed. And then, she'll go to sleep pretty soon. And so I read the books that they had brought. She was sleeping in my old room. So I read the books that I had, and nothing was working. And so I decided to tell her some stories. I just made up stories. I added things. I told family stories. She didn't know some of the people I was talking about, but she would ask me something. Uncle, what about this? Uncle, what about that? She got tired of asking. And when I looked, she was asleep. So storytelling is something. Storytelling has a value. Storytelling has a place in society, and it's something to honor. I've just met our two storytellers, and so I'm looking forward to their presentation. We're going to start with Deborah. She's a professional storyteller with over 25 years of experience, and she served as a storyteller in residence at Atlanta's Apex Museum. She taught storytelling in after-school programs, and she's been a featured storyteller in 33 libraries for the Atlanta Public Library System. She's been at the Newland Wetlands Watershed Festival, the Historic Spirit of Oakland. She's been involved with Fulton County Virtual Arts Initiative and the Mayor's Summer Reading Program. Currently, she's teaching preschool at Stone Mountain Ready School and performs as a story rambler at the Wren's Nest. Okay. So I'd like you to get ready for some interesting, something different presentation. Come in.
Thank you so much. And I promise I won't put you to sleep. Okay, I want to start by thanking Robin for inviting me today. This is our first time meeting, and she was referred to me by Danielle Bunch as the Newman Wetlands. And this is what it's all about, connections. And that's what we're going to talk about today, some of the connections that are helping us preserve stories, but more importantly, why it's important to preserve stories and the power that stories have, especially with African American families, and how it connects individuals with their heritage. Okay, so storytelling roots. I'm a member of Kaumba Storytellers of Georgia for over 25 years. And Kaumba is celebrating their 30th anniversary this year. We are also affiliates of the National Association of Black Storytellers. And I mention that for two reasons. Because this year, NABS, as we call it, is hosting the 43rd Annual Conference and Festival here in Atlanta. And this will be Kaumba's third time hosting this festival. Now, the festival travels all around the country, which brings me to today. In 2023, the festival was in Utah. And when the festival comes to a town, what they do is they host a pre-festival event, a Black History tour, and they had a Black History tour in Utah. And somebody said, there are no Black people in Utah. Well, it's not a chocolate city like Atlanta, but they do have Black people. And more importantly, they have one of the largest and one of the best genealogical associations in Georgia, research centers rather, in Utah. And so as part of the tour, we were able, and I did not participate directly in this part of the festival because I didn't go. You have to go a day ahead. But what they did was they allowed us to bring information about our families. So whoever it was that you wanted to research, wherever you wanted to start, they would help you. But what was really unique about this experience, and this is information that I got from those who participated, was that after you started your search, they connected you with an associate so that even when you went back to your city, you could get help doing the research. And I brought that up because that is what keeps many of us from moving forward and doing research, is that we don't know what to do, we don't know where to start. Now, telling other people's stories. I have 3 pictures here because what I do is, in addition to folk tales, I also do historical portraits. And I'm always doing historical portraits of other people. Some of the characters that you see here are Adrian McNeil Herndon, Marie Antoinette Woolfolk Taylor, who was one of the co-founders of the AKA sorority. And then Adrian McNeil Herndon is the wife of Alonzo Herndon, but she was also a thespian, an actress in her day. And then there's Leah Wright Day, who was responsible for the washerwoman strike of 1881. And these are 3 of my most favorite characters because they live such rich, full lives. But we're always telling other people's stories. And so the historical portraits that we've done, a lot of the characters are, well, all of the characters are real people. I mentioned Oakland and Southview cemeteries because that's where these women are buried. And so there is a lot of history in the cemetery. But as I said, we're always telling other people's stories. And so one year when attending the NABS festival, one of the festival directors told a story. And he told a story about his grandmother. And she was always sewing. And she would get on the sewing machine and she would go, wishy, 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 wishy. And she had these little glasses that she would wear. Well, one day his grandmother passed away. And at the funeral, she was all laid out at that time, laid out in the living room. And when he saw her, she didn't have her glasses on. So he asked someone to take him to the store, and he went to the store and he only had a few cents. And, what are you going to do? I want to get some glasses. So he bought some glasses for his grandmother and he put them on her face. And they said, what are you doing that for? And he said, so that she can see when she gets to heaven. Mm-hmm. And so I said, wow, that was a personal story. Well, I had never told personal stories before. And he told all of us, what we need to start doing, other than just telling historical portraits of somebody else, we need to tell our own stories. And that really touched me. He said, if it's not in writing, it didn't happen. And it's not that this story, his story about his grandmother and the glasses was going to change the world, but it was important to him. It was personal to him. So then I thought, personal stories. So I'm going to start with my surnames. When you're getting ready to tell a story, it's like, well, if I'm going to tell a personal story, where do I start? You have 4 sides to your family. You have your mother's mother and father, and then you have your father's mother and father. So where do you start? So I started looking at my surname, which is Strahorn with no Y. And it means corner or bend, likely referred to someone who lives near a corner or bend. But why does it have a Y in it? Why does one have a Y and the other doesn't? And so I asked my father, I said, because a lot of people would say, I'm from Chicago, and they would say, well, do you know the hanging Judge Strahorn? No, I didn't know him. Do you know Billy Strayhorn? He has a Y in his name. I've heard of Billy Strayhorn, but I don't think I'm related. But I hadn't done any research. And let me tell everyone, I am just sticking my baby toe in the pool of research at this time. I have not done very much of anything, but this is where I'm starting with my surnames. So then there's the last name Hopgood. That's my grandmother's last name, my paternal grandmother's last name. And it could be related to hops, which is in beer. It's interpreted as one who grows crops, showcasing the intersection of agriculture and social stature. So that's a beginning for me. But for 9 years, I attended Hopgood family reunions on my grandmother's side. But all I know about Hopgoods is that they came to Tennessee as slaves. We would meet every year, and you see relatives once a year if you can barely remember their names. But for 9 years, that's all the information I had, was that the Hopgoods came to Tennessee as slaves. So now my brain is starting to churn, and I'm starting to say to myself, there's so much more that needs to be done. So family migration. This is my mother, Kay Aurelia Scott Strahorn. Now, I am from Chicago. That's where my mother migrated to. She was born in Atlanta. She moved to Tennessee when her parents got divorced, and then she later moved to Chicago with her mother. So I'm starting to look at the family migration of different members of my family. My maternal great-grandmother, Emmeline Southall Scott, who was my mother's paternal mother, migrated to Atlanta from Liverpool, Ohio. And the Scott family, which I'll talk about later, came from Mississippi to Atlanta, some of whom came here for school. Well, as I said, the Hopgoods came to Tennessee as slaves, and I migrated to Atlanta seeking my Scott family history. Now, to tell you a little bit about my mother, and this is where the personal story that Dylan talked about comes in. My mother passed away at the age of 33. So I only met her father one time. So when Dylan talked about doing personal stories and telling your family history, I was like, I don't know, because it's painful. So why don't most people tell stories? It's painful, it's personal, you don't know where to start, you don't know what to tell. So Kaumba Storytellers has an event every year called Mama Tales. So the first year they did Mama Tales, I said, I ain't got no Mama Tale to tell. My mother passed away of breast cancer when she was 33. I can't tell that story. So Mama Tales, year 2, year 3, year 5, and the story that Dylan told resonated with me. It didn't have to be a big, tragic story, but it was something close and personal. So by year 5 of Mama Tales, I said, I have a story that I can tell. So I told a story about a birthday party that my mother gave for me when I was about to turn 14. And it was a birthday party that she orchestrated from her deathbed because 3 weeks later, she died. And so when I thought about that Mama Tale, I found joy in it because I wanted to find, well, why did she do that and how did she do it? So I went back to everybody, and this is over 30 years later. I went back to everybody who I remember being at that party, and I asked them, what do you remember about the birthday party that Mom gave me when I turned 14? My father didn't remember. My sister erased that year from her mind. And my cousin Rhonda said, is that the birthday party where I bought the booze? But everybody had a different take on it. But I say all that to say that at the end of that story, I found joy. Because when I walked across the stage to receive my diploma, and they played Diana Ross's Reach Out and Touch Somebody's Hand, and the long arms of my mother reached out and held me with that memory, that's why it's important to capture our stories. I wasn't capturing that story for anybody but me, but it took all of that, the Mama Tales and Dylan's story, to help me understand why it's important to capture our stories. It doesn't have to be capturing them for anybody else out in the world but us, but it's important to document what happens. So the Scott family. So I'm from Chicago. And like I said, my mother died when I was 14. So it just so happened that at her mother's funeral, one of my aunts from Atlanta, whom I had never met, came to the funeral. And when she came to the funeral, I said, this is the Scott side of the family that I wanted to meet. I knew that my family was the founder of the Atlanta Daily World newspaper. I knew that there were 6 brothers, one of whom is my grandfather. He's the tall one in the middle. Let's see, this is, no, you can't see. He's the tall one in the middle, the third one from the left. And these are all the sons. So the history of the Scott newspaper was enthralling to me. It was founded in 1928 by W.A. Scott, who was the third one from the right. He was a graduate of Morehouse College who later worked as the only Black clerk on the Jacksonville to Washington rail line. Then in 1927, he published a Jacksonville business directory to help Blacks find each other. And a year later, he published a similar directory in Atlanta. So I come from a family of storytellers. I come from a family that decided our history was important enough to not just our history as a family, but the history of what was happening in the world, in Atlanta, in the United States. And they were going to be the keepers of that history by publishing a newspaper. But it's a painful story there because W.A. Scott was murdered in 1934. And so what happens to the legacy and the history when its founder is gone? And how do you reclaim that history when the paper is no longer, or that institution is no longer yours? And so there's so many things that I have discovered already without even doing any genealogical research. But it's important for me to do that research. I want to know who my great-grandfather was. When I look at this picture, I'm always asking, well, where's Grandpa? Who was Grandpa? He's not here. And just by doing a Google search, I find out that he died the same year that the paper was founded. Wow. Who was he? I know that he was a minister. I know that he came from Mississippi. So how did my great-grandmother get from Liverpool, Ohio to Mississippi? I know why the family came to Atlanta, because some of the sons went to Morehouse and Morris Brown. But what is that story that happened in Mississippi? Who was my great-grandfather before he was a minister, and where did he come from? So that's why it's important to do this research. I have all this surface information that I found out just from Googling. I have more information that I'm finding out just by talking to other relatives. But what is the background to that? Where did we really come from? So showcasing the importance of genealogical research for Black families. I was reading AARP magazine, and there's an article on Samuel Jackson, and he talks about segregation is painted in lessons from the past. And he tells this story about his grandmother. And I share this because when I was reading this article, I said, oh my goodness, this is his grit. This is the foundation that he stands on. And so if we're not doing our family research and learning about our family history and who did what and why, we don't really have that backbone, so to speak. So he tells a story in this magazine about his grandmother who washed clothes for white people, as did my paternal grandmother. And he said the family was always giving him gifts. Well, one year he didn't send the thank you note soon enough. And the white people started asking his grandmother, did Samuel get the gift we gave? She said, yeah. Well, we ain't got no thank you note yet. You must not be raising your son right. And he says his grandmother took off her apron and put it down and left and never came back. And for one solid year, they would come to her house apologizing and asking her to come back. And she said no, and her husband told her, you don't have to go back. So that story, what does that do for somebody's mind? What does that do for your ego? How does that make you go forward? That was a powerful story. So then he talked about being on the set of a movie, Enslaved. And as part of that, they just happened to do some genealogical research. And he found out that he was connected to Gabon, the Gabonese people. And he went there and he met them. And he said everyone that he looked at looked like him. And then he said he stood there on the shore, looking out at the place where some ships didn't make it. And he had survivor's remorse. And I'm thinking to myself, what does that feel like? But that was his story. And so I have survivor's remorse when I look at the building of the Atlanta Daily World that is no longer ours. I have survivor's remorse or loss. I feel loss, feel remorse at the loss of my childhood home that's no longer ours. And so what are these stories that we have that we can tell because of things that we've experienced? And then Samuel Jackson said, and he went to visit Gabon, and they did a tribal induction ceremony for him. And now he has a passport to Gabon, and he's a Gabonese citizen. How does that make him feel to be connected? So I want to know what that connection is. And then in that same magazine, there were articles about a quest to find family. And this one man went to Hawaii to do his research. That's where his mother and father were from. And all he had was this picture, and he knew a house where they lived and a building where they worked. And he went there to the building where they worked, and it was no longer there. But somebody said, well, they used to live in a certain area, and he went to the area where they used to live, where the old house was. And the people who lived there said, well, maybe the people across the street might know something. And all he had was a photograph. And when he went and knocked on the door and talked to the people, and he was telling him his story, and they showed him the picture, the lady said, well, my name is Luna. I think that was the name. And he turned the picture over, and sure enough, her name was on the back of the picture. And it was her mother and father and sister and brother in that picture. But all of the way from the United States, he goes to Hawaii, and he makes that connection. And then there was another story about DNA kits and how a young lady gave her mother a DNA kit for Christmas, and she does the research, and she finds out that she's connected to people in Sudan. And they went there, they planned an African, a DNA trip to Africa. And then I was reading where you can actually plan these trips based on your DNA. And she goes to the Sudan, and they have a wonderful time. And now she goes back every year. And they take clothing and different things, and now she has a community. So this is why it's important for us to do that research, to make the connections. So discovering facts. Now, as I said, I'm just sticking my toe in the research pool. I haven't done very much of anything. But what I discovered just by going online, that my grandmother, Emmeline's first name was Nancy, that one of my uncles who was in that picture that I showed you was prohibited from running for county coroner and then institutionalized. My great-grandfather passed away the same year the newspaper was published. The Atlanta Daily World became a semi-weekly in 1930, a tri-weekly in 1931, and a daily in 1932. And the Scotts printed over 50 publications around the country. Well, if that doesn't make you stand up and feel proud, what does? But there's so much more to the story. On February 4th, 1934, W.A. Scott, the founder, was shot and killed, and no one was ever convicted of the crime. There's a story there. So some of the first, which I won't go into about the Atlanta Daily World, just a few things. It was the first Black daily in the 20th century. And I was amazed to find that it was the first Black newspaper with an assigned White House correspondent. So that was interesting. But there's so much that can be found when we start to do the research. But why don't we do it? Why don't we search our family histories? And one person I talked to said, well, it's too hard and I don't know where to start. Well, you've got to just start somewhere. A friend of mine did a family history where he just got some pictures and put them in a book and just wrote some captions, and he published it. He self-published it, and he showed it to his family. And that's when the conversation started. Well, that's not so-and-so, that's so-and-so. And how come you didn't use a picture of, I got all these pictures. But he got the ball rolling. He started somewhere. And that's what was important, for us to just start somewhere. Okay, so building the family tree. These are my maternal grandparents, Louis Augustus Scott, which I said was the tall one in the picture. That's my mother's father, whom I only met one time. And I'll tell you the story about that. We were taking a family vacation. My grandmother and grandfather were divorced. And so she was originally from Tennessee. So after she got divorced, she moved back to Tennessee. And later we migrated to Chicago. We were taking a family vacation and we traveled all the way from Chicago to Florida to take a ship to the Bahamas. So we stopped in Kentucky and Tennessee and Atlanta. And we go to Grandma Emmeline's house to see her. And my mother stretches out her arms and says, "Daddy," and sits down on his lap. And then she looks up and she says, "Oh, you're not my daddy. That's my daddy over there," because she had rarely seen him. So the uncle who she was named after, Uncle Aurelius, is the person she thought was her father temporarily. But Louis Augustus is her father. And so that story made me realize how it's important to stay connected. So what are we doing? How does the next generation work together to connect the past and set goals for the future? Well, the Atlanta Daily World is still being published, but it's no longer owned by us. It's owned by Real Times Media. So we have started connecting our individual families through research and meeting. And so there's a contingent of us Scots, and we've gotten together twice over the last couple of years. And we brought photographs and we laid them out on the table. And we said, now, who's your mother and father and how are we connected? And we started making the connections. And we're recapturing the legacy of a family through stories. The institution is gone, so to speak. Yeah, it's still there, but it's not ours. And that's that remorse that we feel. And that's what makes it hard to talk about it. And so that's what keeps me and some other people. What do you say? What do you not say? How much do you tell? How much do you share? Clenora Neely Scott. That's my mother's mother. And even though I grew up with her living right around the corner in Chicago, all I know about her mother is that her name was Granny. And then I said one day, what was Granny's name? It was Sarah Hamer. And then my aunt said, no, it wasn't. It was Sarah Neely. Well, which one was it? Was it Sarah Neely or Sarah Hamer? Well, Grandma's not here to tell us. Maybe Grandma Sarah was married twice and we just don't know about it. I have no idea who my great-grandfather was on my mother's side. So how do I do the research to find that out? I don't know, but I better get started. And lastly, there are stories all around us. At one of the last Hopgood reunions that I went to, because remember I said I've been to 9 Hopgood reunions, and we talked about remembering the past, enhancing the present, and projecting the future. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with this little man right here. This is my father, and these are photographs that I found of my father after he passed away. Who was this 8-year-old little boy? What high school did he graduate from? Where was he stationed in the Army? So that's my to-do. As storytellers, well, let me just back up. So what my family is doing now, the Scott family here, one of us is working on a book. Somebody else is putting together a documentary. Someone else is putting together an exhibition. And it's so funny. A young lady just came in here from another workshop and said, oh, I was at your cousin's house and we're looking through all of this stuff. And I'm like, who, what, huh? And she's found letters. My cousin was selling Uncle CA's house. He took over the newspaper after his brother passed away. And so she and I exchanged information, and we're going to get together because I was just there a few weeks ago when she was selling the house. But there are so many treasures. But I'll end with this. In the storytelling world, we say that every time a person dies, a library closes unless you continue to tell their story. So let's continue to tell our stories. Thank you.
We have part 2 coming up about storytelling. Gloria Elder will be with us, telling us stories from childhood, telling us stories in general. She's been telling stories since she's been a child. She loves stories that have adventures, and she liked to tell them growing up telling stories about her loving grandparents. She's also an author. In 2011, she published I Walked a Mile in Her Shoes, a story of unconditional love. And she's working on her next book. I always like that, working on my next book. It's not I'm working on a book, because you have a date, you have a title, you know where you're going. I named your daddy after the mailman. She's a member of the Kumba Storytellers of Georgia, the National Association of Black Storytellers, and the National Storytelling Network. She's a Spelman grad, and we're proud to have her here.
When I was growing up, I spent a lot of time. Thank you, Maverick. When I was growing up, I spent a lot of time around my grandparents, Big Mama and Big Papa, on their farm in Newton, Georgia. Loved helping out with the chores and playing with all of my cousins and spending lots and lots of time learning about life and our family. I lived about walking distance from the farm, but my brothers and I realized that our adventures there took us miles and miles away through time and space, thanks to Big Mama's and Big Papa's stories. Well, good afternoon. It is such a pleasure to be with you and to share with you some of the things that I have learned through capturing the stories of my ancestors. My name is Gloria Elder, and that's me, in case you didn't know, as a little girl, right there in that picture. When I was growing up, I'm trying to find okay, I don't have to do that. All right. My storytelling background extends, like I said, back to childhood, when my grandmother always, whenever I visited her, she had me learn a story or either learn a poem. Let's say a poem. And she said to me, if I saw her on Monday, she said, I want you to learn this by Friday and come back and say it for me. Wow, I started to get curious. I said, Big Mama, why do I have to learn all of these poems? And she looked me straight in the eye and she said, because you hang out with me, you go to all of these churches. She said, so if anybody ever asks you to say anything, you got something to say. So that's how I started beginning to be able to tell and share stories. My storytelling background also comes from the Kaumba Storytellers of Georgia, and I've been with them almost 20 years. And that storytelling background also included some of the things that Deb shared with you about. But some of the main things about my storytelling background comes from me and my sharing stories with everybody I knew or everybody I met. I was once an early childhood educator and director of a child care center, and I would tell stories in the meetings. And one day a lady said to me, you know, you have all of these wonderful stories about growing up with your family. You need to be telling these stories on stage, or you need to be sharing these stories even more. So as time went on, I started to, as they say, I started to put it in the universe that I wanted to tell stories with the group. And lo and behold, and some of y'all may know what that means, that comes from the country. Lo and behold, I ran into a young man by the name of Akbar Imhotep. He's an ancestor divine, but he was very key in making sure that the Kaumba Storytellers continues as it does today. And I met him, and I hired him to do some work when I was working with a program to develop programs for children on stress education. And he served as the puppeteer for that program as we were building the curriculum. And I shared those stories with him, and he said, you need to come to the Kaumba Storytellers of Georgia and go to a meeting. So he invited me to a meeting, and he said, you need to have some stories to share at that meeting. And of course I did. Guess what? The stories that I was told, I wrote them down. When I was told stories by my big mama and big papa, they were so intriguing. I wanted to know, well, how did that happen? And those kind of things. So I asked a lot of questions. I sat at their feet. I wanted to know everything I could about my grandparents. So today I want to explore with you some of the things that I learned just by hanging out with my grandparents. So let's explore the power of oral histories and genealogy in preserving our family legacies, because both are important as we begin to connect our roots. I was born about 35 miles south of here in Newnan, Georgia. Some of you may know where that is. My family of origin is the Smiths. And Smith means people that are good with their hands. That's the background. People like blacksmiths, people who work and create. And we were African American. As I said, I was born there. My grandmama brought me into the world, right there on that land. We were a community in Newnan, Georgia, rural, agrarian. And we had an agrarian lifestyle where everybody worked. My great-grandfather was a landowner. And he was a farmer and a minister. And he had values that were really straight up, hardworking, educated. He wanted to be educated. He wanted his family to follow in education. He was highly spiritual. And the most important thing that I learned about my great-grandfather, is that he wanted to do something to help his race. So, back in the time when I was young, the one way that my grandparents got people together was they would have family reunions. And this is one of the family reunions when I was really young. And this brought people together from all over, even people that had migrated. I have family that migrated, a huge part of my family, from Newnan to Cedartown to Columbus, Ohio. And they always came to everything that was happening in Newnan, Georgia, because that was the land where they were born. They didn't want to us to come to Ohio, although we went a couple of times and it was not the same as it was on this farm, on this land. So we would have fun, food and games and laughter down by the pond. So this is where that picture was taken. Then, of course, as we moved forward, my big mama said to me, one day, I want you, I don't know how to move this back. 2, 3, 4. This is my grandfather. Am I moving too fast? Where's the up and down, forward and back? Okay.
There it goes. It hides sometimes.
Okay. All right. So when we got ready to have this family reunion at that point in time, all of my big mama's children were grown. And they had moved away. And they were no longer helping her do the family reunion. So she said to me, look, I know I want you to help me do a family reunion. Now, mind you, I walked about in this woman's shoes. So I said, Big Mama, I don't know nothing about birthing no babies. She said, don't worry, I'm going to be with you. So she said, I said to her, well, I can help, but I want to know who these two people are in this picture that you have always always hanging in your house. She said, that's your great grandfather and your great grandmother. And they're one of their oldest children. That's Eliza. And she said, I said, well, then, can I talk about them at the family reunion? She said, yes. So she let me take these pictures down to the farm, down to the pond, and display them. And when my aunts and uncles, her sons and daughters came to the reunion, they said, how did you get Mama to let these pictures be on down here? She won't let us even take them off the wall. So I said, because I told her I could help with the family reunion, but I needed to know, be able to share with people who these folks are. So then that started the ball rolling. I'm going to talk about the Smith family first, because that's the family that I was around most of my life. My grandparents and grandmother lived in walking distance, as I said, to the farm. And they had all of the grandchildren come around all the time. And they would tell stories every afternoon after we finish all of our chores. So when I decided that this is something I wanted to do more of, I started to create a family tree. Now, mind you, I had no idea about how to do anything like this. But as the saying goes, you gotta start somewhere. I was so interested until I created a big page, about as big as half of this board, as you can see, of all the family members. Big Mama and Big Papa had 14 children. And I started to get these names and then put the children's names under them. This is my rudimentary kind of way as I got started. When I wanted to share more information and I had all of these questions, I said, well, I'm going to have to do something to get other people involved, because family reunions was too much fun and games and I wasn't learning enough. I wanted to know who is Uncle Jack and how is he related to me? Who is Aunt Susie and how's she related to my daddy and mama? So I created this tree, and this started us to actually begin to connect. Because when people walk up and this is displayed on a tree somewhere, they see their name or they see their family name, they start to tell you, well, that ain't right. This goes here, that goes there. No, 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 no. So we began to build on that. And after we got that far, I started to look into genealogy and to find a more complete picture of who I was and where I came from. So this is my grandfather, my great-grandfather. My great-grandfather was named William Jackson Smith. William Jackson Smith was born in 1864. What was that? The end of the Civil War, right? During the Civil War. And he was born free, but he knew his mama and daddy, Jack and Eliza Smith. He lived with them until he was 23, and they had land. And he moved all along. And finally, he moved out with his wife and 2 children after he married. And he began to build on his land. The first year he built, guess what? He didn't have nothing was salvaged. He owed money. But the owner said to him, the people he was indebted to say, okay, I'm gonna give you a chance. He started with $3. He said, we're gonna give you a chance now. And the next year he had a profit of $40. And every year after that, the profit grew larger and larger and larger. Over time, this man you see here owned half of Noonan. He had over 1,000 acres. He was known as the most highly respected farmer in Noonan, Georgia. While he was doing that, he decided to become a minister. And he was ministering in LaGrange, Georgia, as well as in Meriwether County and in Noonan, having over 3,000 members. And he did not do that without getting his education too. He went to the Atlanta Baptist College, now known as Morehouse College. And he worked alongside other people like Horace Mann Bond, who knew my great-grandfather. So he was a leading farmer, but he was also a highly respected and prominent Baptist minister. Things that you learn about your family. I learned this through a genealogy search because nobody had told me this. I also learned that the things that he went through helped shape that family, the family that I was born into. One thing I remember is that when we collect oral histories and we pass them down through spoken word, we need to do more than just pass them down. We need to write them down. It's important, of course, to have these oral histories and preserve these personal and cultural narratives, but you gotta record them in written form. So how do you do that? I began to collect interviews, asking the older relatives to share their experiences at family reunions. I had one family reunion where I had all of the generation ahead of me, my aunts and uncles. I had them have a special day just for them. And the reunion was set up just saying that we were honoring them. So they felt special. So they came out and they shared stories of who they were and where they came from. And I was able to record those. In memory mapping, we began to identify the places and events. When you hear people tell stories, it's more than just what they're saying. Sometimes it's what they're not saying that kind of like makes you say, I need to ask them that question, or I need to do more research. So I learned through memory mapping that my great-grandfather also was the family soothsayer. The first 12 days of every year, he would go out and commune under the stars and predict the future for the rest of the year. That was so intriguing to me because as I grew up older, I have this personal connection to nature. And when I need to de-stress and when I need to get clarity in my mind, I hang out in nature. So that connected me to him. But the most important thing I want to say is documentation. How do we document that? We have these stories. We have them, but where do we put them so they can be viewed on a larger scale? The next thing I have here is my big mama. This is his wife. They were married more than 75 years. Now, we share these stories to keep the family history alive and pass it on to younger generations. And at one time, I thought that was not happening. Until one day, one of my nieces said to me, and I have to call my name by what my family calls me. My name is Gloria Fern, and my family calls me Fern. She said to me once, I want to know all that you know. And guess what they did? Within 2 years after that last family reunion, those youngins had a family reunion and we all went and enjoyed ourselves. So they are beginning to catch on now, and that makes me so happy. So happy. Through family, we have recorded our family gatherings. We have a family archive where we're keeping pictures. We have an archive of pictures where an aunt who has more than 1,000 pictures going back generations. So it's so important to share these stories to help future generations understand their roots and to develop a sense of belonging. When my nieces and nephews, my children walk on that land, they have no idea how much work went into having this kind of land. And so that impacted the youth so much that today they are embarking upon a family reunion that comes up in June of this year, another one that they plan to hold. So it's important that we begin to gather these stories, record them, put them together so that they can be, whether you want to do a book, whether you want to all put it online somewhere so that other family members can view it. But if you do, you're surely going to get some feedback. Some of the things you don't know, or some of the things you think you know that you know and you don't know. Somebody will tell you if they see it, if they have the opportunity to read it, that helps you get back on track. So when you look at your genealogy research, be sure that you look at how you want to do that research. For an example, you could do it. I went through Ancestry.com and also the Georgia Genealogical Society. And I went through the Georgia Genealogical Society first because 5 generations, I'm the 5th generation that lives on that same land today. If you got some great-great-grandparents and your great-grandparents who were slaves, they started this and the son followed. And then my big papa, the story of my big papa, when you saw him, I forgot to tell you, is that along the way, my great-grandfather kind of lost track of his loans. He borrowed money against his land. And you know it was taken, sold on the doorsteps of the court. Well, I tell you what happened. Somebody knew of the upstanding family called the Smiths, and they had purchased some of that land, and they went back to my grandparents at the end of the day after the courthouse and knocked on the door that night, and they said, "We want to sell you back this land. All you got to do is pay what we pay, which is just the back taxes." Well, my grandmama, being the thrifty woman that she is, she had 2 sons who went off to World War II and they weren't married. She said, send your money home to me. And they did. And she put that in their can and maybe in the backyard under the tree, wherever she had it. She took it out and she gave the man the money. I can even tell you to this day what she said to me, $1,918 and 30-some cents. Can you imagine? And that's the land that I live on today. That my family still lives on that land. My aunt is 96, turning 97 in March. I'm interviewing her. My uncles, my brothers, all my brothers went back to the land. A lot of my cousins didn't move from the land. So that gives me cause to feel a bit connected. And it also gives me cause to know that I have a responsibility to share this and to pass it forward. That we can't sit on our laurels and think that somebody else can do it. We have to do it for ourselves. Nobody else is going to do that but us, for us. So when you go out and you look at who you are and where you came from, I always remember these words from my big mama. If you don't know where you come from, you can't know where you're going. So it's important that you find out who you are and from whom you come. So when you do your genealogy research, you can find many methods, and I'm sure those of you who was in that workshop before this one, I mean, that's just to have some information. She had some great information, Jeanette. So go through Ancestry.com, Georgia Genealogy Society. You can look at DNA searches. I did a DNA search. And the highest number that I had was 33% of my DNA comes from Mali. Who knows? I'm still searching. But I have gotten to this point. I have courthouse documents, birth and marriage records. I have land and property information. And then I have family photos and obituaries. This is my grandmother and grandfather, Big Mama and Big Papa, Laura and Margaret Smith, at their 50th wedding anniversary. We gave that to them as a way of honoring them. In my family, the elders are always honored, but that's an African tradition. I know I'm connected to Africa. I know I'll get there and know where I came from soon. So it's important finding thoughts is to blend both. Combining your oral history with your genealogy research is going to build a more complete family legacy. I encourage you to start collecting stories, researching genealogy, and search and share with the future generations. And understand that bridging generations and reinforces a sense of identity, who we are and where we came from. But get started, no matter where you are, get started where you are when you can. Interviews, research, online, gather old family documents. You too can do this, as I have started. Thank you.
Well, based on our time today, we're not going to have time for questions and answers formally, but you'll be around for a few minutes afterwards? Okay. We've had a great day, 4 wonderful sessions, 5 wonderful speakers. Some things to keep in mind that came up several times during the day. Thinking about context, about what the periods of time were of these people, thinking about getting started. I love that last line. I talked to a couple of people in the room today. Just get started. As I said this morning, if you're holding some funeral program from some period of time in your family, you're already doing family research. Okay, you're doing it now. So just expand it and make it something that you can pass on to someone else. Robin, thank you so much for this day. Thank you for the archive. They're just magnificent. And thank you all for being here today.